Hello guys, I'm Mathilda. Welcome to the second part of the Look at History series, where I take a look at the development history and some historical facts of some tanks in game. This time I'm gonna take on the British infantry tanks. Of course, you have to start with the Mathilda Mark I. By the way, the version in-game is actually the Mathilda Mark II. That's why you probably won't recognize this thing as the Mathilda. But basically, the Mathilda I was such crap. They built a tank with the same name and then said, okay, you know the Mathilda I? Let's just forget all about this. Shame on that tank. We will never ever speak of it again. Because, as you can see, it's a very simple tank. Back then, the British economy was a bit not that well, so they tried to get tanks that were as cheap as possible, and this tank is of a very simple construction. It's basically an armored box, heavily armored box, 60 millimeters up front, so it was relatively hard to actually penetrate that armor. And it had a small turret on top with a either a Vickers 303 or 50 caliber Vickers machine gun, or inch technically, but that doesn't really matter. And what's obvious on that tank is the tracks. They are very far off the size of the tank, or at least so it seems. That's pretty bad, if you ask me, because the way the tracks are right here, they are practically unprotected. You wouldn't have any trouble, even in a Panzer II, to just shoot off the tracks with a couple of rounds. So that's obviously pretty bad, and it wasn't an exceptional track system either. It was a simple leaf spring suspension. Nothing exceptional about it. So this thing was essentially slow. It was really slow. It was about 12 kilometers per hour or 8 miles per hour if you're American. So essentially you could outrun it on a straight line. If you are just a walking soldier, you would outrun this thing. And yeah. Another thing is the armament. It was a simple Vickers machine gun, either 303 or .50, which meant if this thing ran into another tank and had the 303 machine gun, it wouldn't stand a chance. It would just do nothing. If it had the 50, maybe Panzer I, but a Panzer II would already be too much. So this thing was an utter failure. It was basically, okay, it was a moving machine gun with a lot of armor on it. That's all this thing could do. Basically, any tankette would probably outperform this thing. So it was such a failure, no wonder nobody actually speaks about it, and it didn't even make it into World of Tanks. So yeah, obviously utter failure, this tank. Now let's move on to the actual Mathilda, the Mathilda II, as seen here. It's got a little bit better armor, 75 millimeter, almost in all faces. Now the British, they knew about sloped armor, but they didn't use that knowledge in the same way the Russians or the Germans did. They instead said, okay, we got, let's say, right here, sloped plate at roughly 60, maybe 70 or 80 degrees. Now they said, okay, if we make this plate actually thinner than 75 millimeter, just, let's say, 30 millimeter, the effective armor, because of the slope, will still be effectively 75 millimeter, and that's what we're going for. And that's how they saved a lot of weight. That means they got 75 millimeters of effective armor, which was basically immune against all German 5 centimeter guns at the time, and still kept the weight within pretty reasonable 26 tons, which was supported by pretty much any bridge at that time. Now, funny thing about the suspension is you might actually recognize it. I mean, okay, it's largely covered here by armor, which is, by the way, based armor, so don't try heat charges on that thing. You see two-wheel bogey, two-wheel bogey, two-wheel bogey, and another two bogies. And, well, from which tank might we know that suspension? Oh yeah, the Vickers Medium, which was, by the way, also developed by Vickers, just as the Mathilda and the later Valentine, and also the Mathilda I, by the way. By the way, the beta server is just a bit sluggish here. See, two-wheel bogey, just four of them, actually, but still, they pretty much copied the suspension onto the Mathilda, because it was proven to work on that tank, so why not build another tank with the same suspension? So essentially got the suspension back from the Vickers, and this tank was performing exceptionally well. In game it is on tier 4, so it's basically on par with the German Panzer III with a 5cm gun. And back in North Africa, the Mathilda basically ran up mostly against the same kind of tank. Mostly ran up against the Panzer III and the earlier versions of the Panzer IV with the short-barreled gun. Now let's take a look at that thing, just so you have an image. Beta server, it's a bit sluggish. I don't know, they put 15,000 slots on each server, 2 servers, and each server has a queue of over 60,000 players, so please Wargame, make bigger beta servers, just at this point. So this is actually the late war version. This was the earlier version. Look at the penetration of that gun, 43 millimeters. Nothing. The 5cm gun of the Panzer III wasn't actually mounted in the Panzer IV, except for a bit of hypothetical prototyping. But they saw they could mount that gun, and then that gun, so why they'll mount this gun instead? Nothing gained. So essentially, the 5cm gun also only 67mm penetration. All around, except maybe even at the rear actually, the Mathilda was pretty much immune against those 5cm guns at that time. And that's why it got a nickname, the Queen of the Desert. Because the only way to take it down at that time was to use the 8.8cm flak guns the Germans had. And they were basically the emergency solution for heavy tanks. On the Eastern Front, in North Africa, anywhere. If they had a tank that couldn't penetrate the puny tank guns they had at the time, well, they simply shoved up some 88mm guns into a hole and let them take on the tanks. Worked pretty well, and got rid of good number of Mathildas. The Mathilda was powered, as far as I'm concerned, by 2 AEC bus engines, and later 2 parallel diesel engines, which were both running on diesel, if I'm not mistaken here. Explains the fire chance, at least. Well, that was an odd solution at best. So basically, it was a bit problematic because of the maintenance, because you had to do maintenance on 2 engines in one tank. That was a bit nasty. But on the other hand, if one engine broke down, the tank could essentially limp back with only one engine. Which was a, well, at least decent idea. Because the tank could basically limp back home and didn't need to be towed home. Which would mean they would need another tank to tow the tank. Well, another thing the tank has is obviously the 2-pounder gun. It was a reasonably good anti-tank gun at the time, but there is a small problem in the game in general with this 2-pounder gun, which is this, because this didn't exist. As I mentioned at some other point, the British had in most tanks 2 or 6-pounder guns. And these things didn't have high explosive shells. I mean they did develop a high explosive shell for the 2-pounder at some point, but for some reason they thought, nah, let's not put it in there. I don't know. Have a bad feeling. I don't know whether there was an actual reason except for somebody just screwing up. So this thing didn't have an high explosive shell. Didn't exist. At least not in service. There is actually one Churchill that doesn't have the high explosive shell, which is the Churchill III and the Russian tactic, the Land-Lease version, which actually doesn't genuinely not have a high explosive shell. But then again, on the Russian side, high explosive shells, everywhere you look, British got high explosive shells. Obviously, they didn't. Because whenever they needed high explosive shells, they simply took the closed support version of the tank, which mounted, in the case of the Mathilda, a 3-inch howitzer. Okay, looks roughly the same. The barrel is more cylindrical, less conical, but essentially that's what they did. They mounted howitzers with a few high explosive shells and mostly smoke shells. So essentially they had tanks with the dedicated purpose of laying smoke, which you could also do by mortars or tiny little smoke launchers on the side of the turret like these here. But, well, why not dedicate an entire tank to that purpose? And not just a device on a tank. Well, at least the two-pounder could penetrate the early Panzer IIIs and IVs frontally with their 30mm armor. When they were up armored to 50mm, they had to close in at nearly point-blank range for that. And when they were up armored to 80mm, this thing was basic. By that time it was so obsolete they didn't use it anymore. But yeah, by that time the Germans had long-barreled 75mm guns on the Panzer IVs, which meant the armor was obsolete. So basically they had slow tanks that had insufficient armor and insufficient firepower to do anything, so they were taken out of service slowly and replaced by the Valentine. Now the Valentine will pop out in about 5 minutes. Oh no, actually much quicker. The Valentine was a replacement for the Mathilda because the Mathilda was very costly. As you can see, the front is cast. Casting is a pretty simple job, but it's hard to actually control the thickness of the armor with that. So it was often that the plates got thicker than they were intended to be. So they had a poor guy who scraped off all the extra armor of the Mathilda, which took hours and hours and so many hours of work. So they essentially just said, okay, we need something cheaper than the Mathilda again. Because this thing, although it's good, we would like something a lot cheaper. So Vickers came up with the Valentine, which was essentially cheaper. But to talk about the Valentine, you have to first go through the Cruiser Mark I. Essentially, you will notice something between the Valentine and the Cruiser Mark I, which is the suspension system. Because it's basically identical. Now, if the garage would finally actually do something, I could show you. See, 3-wheel bogie suspension, 3-wheel bogie suspension. The Cruiser Mark I was a pretty big failure, mostly because it had a relatively small 150 horsepower engine. I mean, okay, the tank only weighed about 12 tons and was reasonably fast. No problem here. But the engine was relatively small and the suspension. It was a good suspension overall, but unlike, let's say, the Christie suspension of the Cruiser Mark III, as you can see here, it wasn't very well suited to high speeds, so yeah, that was a bit problematic. Also, the track system wasn't very reliable, especially at high speeds. So you often threw off your tracks on accident, which happened a lot on this thing. Another problem with this tank was all the secondary turrets here, because they created essentially a shot trap. Shot trap is, let's say you shoot about from this angle, bounce off this armor plate here, the side of the driver's compartment. It would cram in somewhere here and block the turret traverse of the secondary turret, or do something worse. And that was a lot of a problem. Here you would have the same kind of issue. And here again, and even here. That was totally bad idea to have the secondary turrets that way, but okay. They just built a tank that way. When they made the Cruiser Mark II, they fixed a few of these issues. They still used the same suspension system, but they removed the turrets, and by the way, that's the close support version, which I drive in my spare time. And if it would kindly show me the 2-pounder version, which you would see more commonly, you would, yeah, okay, 2-pounder version. Is the turret correct as well? Yeah, the turret is fine. It only had a hull-mounted machine gun, which was a lot simpler. Problem with this was, this down here is a Bather machine gun. This up here is a Vickers machine gun. They use different ammunitions. So you had to carry 2 different types of machine gun ammunition, and if you mixed them up on accident, it was generally a bad idea. Because you could spend 5 minutes to unjam your goddamn machine guns. By that time, the infantry could plant all kinds of sticky charges or whatsoever on your tank. Bad idea. So eventually they replaced the tank machine guns entirely with the Bather machine gun because it had a much better performance. For example, a high rate of fire. But they kept the Vickers in infantry service. So essentially, also the Cruiser Mark II was designated a heavy cruiser because, as you can see, the armor was up to 30 mm at the front. If you look back at the Cruiser Mark I, only 40 mm, about half the armor thickness. Which meant the tank had the same engine, but weighed quite a lot more. 12 tons compared to, I believe, what was it, 15 tons or so? Great, garage is lagging again. Sorry about that. No way I can fix that. So basically, the Cruisers Mark I and II were just intermediate solutions until they could finally get their hands on the Christie tank, which eventually evolved into this thing. And also on the Soviet side evolved into the BT series and the T-34. So essentially, Vickers just thought, we still got that old suspension system and chassis from the Cruisers Mark I and II. How about we just put a lot more armor on it to have about the same armor as the Mathilda, and put a different turret on it, which also has heavier armor. And obviously, roughly, well, actually, slightly weaker engine, but who cares? And the tank was a lot cheaper to produce than the Mathilda because the suspension was simple but effective. The armor was mostly welded and bolted, which was a lot easier to manufacture than cast armor pieces. Well, the turret was roughly the same. Actually, it's a slight mistake that is actually a 2-man turret. In this case, you only got the commander, who doubles as gunner and radio operator as well, and the loader. Actually, in this version, with the 2-pounder, it still had a 3-man turret. Commander, separate gunner, and loader, while the commander also had the radio. Typical British tank doctrine. Yeah, they only had to take out the 3rd man when they put in the 6-pounder gun, which actually should fit into that turret as far as I know, but not entirely sure at this point. So anyway, you got a 2nd turret, low load capacity. That's some sort of pretty late war turret. I don't really recognize it from anything. Was probably one of the very last turrets. And there you can put in a 6-pounder gun, or even a 75mm gun in theory. But I know the tank was fitted with 6-pounder guns, which basically made the Valentine I II a bit redundant. Let's take a look at that for a short moment. UK, Valentine I II, I need to research it, sorry. So, that's it, the Valentine I II. Basically, it was just an idea of Vickers to mount a 6-pounder gun with gun shield and carriage onto the tank by dismounting the turret and just mounting the gun in the place. Well, essentially, the project was scrapped because they found out, that 6-pounder, it actually fits into the turret, so why should we make this kind of crap? But there was something else I want to mention at least. There was something that was called the Archer. It was a series-produced tank destroyer based on the Valentine, which never made it into the game. Instead, we got this crappy thing. Basically, the Archer was something pretty much comparable to the German Marder II. Let's see, Marder II looked about, come on. Really, upgrade your servers to the beta, please, Wargaming. Looked about, oh great, I need the tracks again. Looked roughly like that, the Marder II. Actually, can't imagine how the Marder III looked like. Was basically the same thing on the 38T chassis, also with the superstructure and the gun further back. Now, the Valentine I II was the same basic concept. Let's go back. But the gun was mounted backwards. Basically, you had the superstructure here and the gun mounted that way, to the rear. So it essentially looked like a Marder III, like the later version with a superstructure back. But just the other way around, the gun faced backwards. Now, I would have loved to see this thing in-game instead of this kind of cheap nonsense, which wasn't actually built in any meaningful number. But, yeah, why put in a series-produced tank destroyer if you can't put in crap? Seriously. I mean, probably, I can argue the Achilles and the Firefly, okay, they were basically American tanks just modified with a British gun, but the Archer would have been 100% British tank design. Series produced, very successful, but no. Nobody cared for that. It's a bit sad. So back to the Valentine. To the actual Valentine. Basically it was just a cheap version of the Mathilda, with a bit more potential for upgunning. But that's it, that's all the Valentine actually was. By the way, the name has it was presented to the Admiralty Board or something at Valentine's Day. So I hate bureaucracy, so don't blame me if I don't properly remember bureaucracy pieces here. So that's how it got its name. And essentially, it was a lot cheaper than the Mathilda, so they said, okay, let's produce that thing until we get something proper like the Churchill, which essentially was all but proper. Now, this is the historical version, by the way. I actually have the tank, so actually I have this gun mustache, I have the turret mustache, I just swapped it for the stock ones to show you the historical version of the tank. Essentially, this thing is the first infantry tank not to be produced by Vickers, or to be developed by Vickers. It was developed in part by Vauxhall, which today still produces cars, so you might recognize that name. It had a, in the Mark I version, had a cast turret, which by the way is but ugly, but okay, with an internal mantlet and a 2-pounder gun, Baser machine gun, and a 75mm howitzer in the hull. And by the way, the hull armor of 177mm is just as the Churchill III, only this plate. This is only 88mm or 89mm armor. Depends a bit. So essentially the armor on the Churchill is still crap compared to something like the KV, which has, let's say, roughly the same armor but sloped. Yeah. Essentially, this thing performed bad. Because, again, like the first Mathilda, they made the mistake of making the tracks open all around. Which meant they had really trouble keeping the dirt out. And obviously presented a lot of space to knock off, to put sticky charges on the tracks. Another thing was it has 2 guns. Now there are a couple of tanks which we might remember for having such a feature. One is the American, where is it? M3 Lee, or the Grant. I believe the Grant was a British version, named after General Ulysses S. Grant, which also had that dual gun concept, which was an utter failure. Ah, there, finally. USA, M3 Lee. Now the M3 Lee, perfect example on how multi-gun platforms fail. 75mm gun in the hull and 37mm gun in the turret. Here a machine gun, there a machine gun, and actually there are another 2 machine guns, which are, by the way, fixed. They can't turn even a single degree. Unlike, let's say, a ball-mounted machine gun, which, well, just about everybody else used at the time. So essentially, if you sat in the turret, you had a horrible time aiming the gun, because the hull had to change direction all the time because of that gun. And even if you were operating that gun, you still had problems because the driver constantly had to turn the tank a tiny bit to actually hit something with these machine guns, because these things were fixed. Just didn't think, let's do a ball mount, so that the gun can at least move a little bit. No, let's move the entire tank just because of a single machine gun, or 2 in that case. So essentially, the tank performed crap. The only thing about it that was reasonably good was the firepower of the 75mm gun, which was at that time pretty good. Pretty damn good, in fact. But it was just a hasty solution because the Americans got some false reports. The majority of German tanks would mount 75mm guns, which they didn't. It was more like 1/4 of the tanks, which was, by the way, the Panzer IV. So, going back to the Churchill, it was essentially the same problem. Hull-mounted howitzer gun for use against bunkers, while the turret was supposed to defeat tanks. Horrible combination, because that way the entire tank had to constantly turn all the time, and you would have a hard time hitting tanks in the turret because you had to aim in on the tank a dozen times until the driver suddenly decided, let's finally stop here. Also, an odd thing about the Churchill, at least in terms of World of Tanks, it has 2 gunners, which gives you a bit of redundancy. If your gunner in the turret dies, you still have the hull gunner to replace him, and give you at least relatively good accuracy. It's like having command of the jack of all trades. So you don't have to revive your gunner quite that often, at least, but that's about all positive there is about the Churchill. Now, if we go to the Churchill 7, you can see it has heavily reinforced armor, 152mm in the front, and if you upgrade the turret, the same applies there, plus the tracks, which, by the way, count as slightly spaced armor. It still it was upgunned in the meantime to first a 6-pounder gun, I believe, on the Mark IIIs and IVs, and later to a 75mm gun obviously the 75mm gun is slightly inferior in penetration to the 6-pounder. But these high explosive shells actually existed on this thing. Because this thing essentially fired the same ammunition as the Sherman. The Sherman had excellent high explosive shells. Also, they replaced the hull howitzer with a simple Baser machine gun, which, by the way, you can see also in the turret. They, by that time, had long standardized that kind of armament problem. Also, they finally covered up these gigantic tracks. Yeah, that's actually pretty much all there is. Problem with the Churchill was generally relatively low load capacity, engine power. I mean, this thing weighed almost 40 tons, which was a lot heavier than the Sherman, about 5 tons. But it had a engine that was maybe 2/3 as good, only 350 horsepower. Not gonna mount because, well, no visual difference anyway. And don't want to go through the tracks because the garage is lagging too badly. Yeah, anyway. Also, they, by that time, copied the Germans' commander's copula. Because the Germans were the first ones to actually invent such a device. Later, the Russians copied it, first with the T-34-85. The Americans copied it on their Shermans. And, well, at last, the British finally copied it, because here you see it's basically just a hatch. I don't know, those are actually the hinges of the hatch, not actual observation devices. I think it's hard to say. Never was an actual Churchill 1, so it's hard to say. Now, the last actual infantry tank development was the Black Prince, which is left to be mentioned. Because by that time they had the Comet with the modified 70-pounder gun, the so-called 77mm HV, or high velocity, which was essentially a slightly shortened 17-pounder with different ammunition, which performed well. So they tried to pull the same trick on the Churchill, but the turret was obviously too small. So they made the tank a good bit wider. If you compare it directly, you see pretty narrow tank, pretty wide tank. Also, modified suspension system, so they could install a larger turret, which was in turn large enough for this gigantic 17-pounder gun, which penetrates 171mm of armor. That's more than the Panther's gun in game. So the British had an excellent anti-tank gun based on the Churchill, but by the time this beast actually finished, World War II was over, and they didn't actually need such a tank gun. And also, they tried to go more for a medium tank design instead of relying on the infantry cruiser tank doctrine, trying to unifying the tanks a bit. So obviously, they tried to build a more mediocre tank that had both armor and both speed, while still having a lot of firepower. Trying to get the advantages of both kinds of tanks. And essentially that's what we today have. Tanks that have both speed and armor, and a lot of firepower as well. So essentially this thing was obsolete by the time they finished it. But it was a good idea generally. Just in World of Tanks is a bit obsolete because it essentially still has the same armor as the Churchill 1 tier lower. Well, it only has a slightly better gun. I mean, you can see the 77mm gun is basically only slightly shorter version of the same gun, with only a pretty modest improvement in terms of penetration. I mean, you see, it actually shoots slower, a lot slower, while the increase in damage per shot is minimal. And the penetration also only about 23mm more with armor-piercing shells. That's nothing to be proud of, seriously, but okay, yeah. And also the 70-pounder, I wouldn't actually say it fired high explosive shells. because simply it was an anti-tank gun for the British, and anti-tank guns for the British didn't fire high explosive shells. They never really changed that. The only point where they changed that was when they made the 75mm gun, which was intended as a dual-purpose gun. So, yeah, this concludes my this part of the series, Look at History, about the infantry tanks. Next time I'll give you a full view of the British cruiser tanks up to the Comet. And after that I'll go for the British post-war tanks, which we in part have in the game. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you some other time.